Welcome, everyone. It's Thursday afternoon, and it's time for the second weekly edition of the Hockey Debates podcast. We always talk about this week. We usually call it This Week in NHL Betting, but we're going to call it for the foreseeable future This Week in Hockey Betting because really there's not a whole lot of NHL to bet on right now. There's a few things we're going to talk about today, and as always, I'm joined by my esteemed partner, Hall of Fame hockey writer Kevin Allen. And basically, they took away our dog parks this week in Ontario, Kevin. I can't take the dogs to the dog park anymore, which has really kind of broken their hearts because they love to go run and play with the other dogs. So all we can do is walk, and they just keep forlornly looking at the padlocked dog park that they can no longer go to. So they go, what was the latest loss in America, in Michigan, I guess, of things you could do last week that you can't do this week?
Well, there's everything. We've been under complete lockdown, and my family has been um, basically sheltering in place for 3 weeks, and we're basically doing it in combination with my daughter and her husband and her children. Like none of us are going outside. We don't. We're having our groceries delivered now, and we just don't have any contact with anyone else. And the reason we've been sort of doing it together is that at least we can sort of see each other. And so we've now moved undisclosed locations. We've gone from our homes to our lake house, and that's where we're at now. And just to kind of break it up. And yeah, the one thing I think that's we've all kind of come to grips with during this, besides just the fear of getting the virus, is how difficult it is these days to self-entertain if once you get weary of watching 8 hours of television today. Many people says, "Oh, I'll find things to do," and some people are. Some people are gardening, and some people are, fixing things around the house. But if you're not handy and you don't have a green thumb, it's pretty quick before you run out of things, and you realize what a role sports plays in our lives. Particularly, obviously, this applies to people who are just sports fans, but even though I covered hockey for 35 years, just like you, I'm a sports fan. And, when I'm relaxing, I like to turn on, a sporting event. And, I'm just curious enough about tennis and golf and everything else that I can always find something I'm interested in, except now there's nowhere to go. So I'm at the lake house now just for a different scenery. But we're still, sheltering in place. We're not going out. And, that one of my friends put it best. He said, he's off and he finally has the time to do some of the things that he'd always wanted to do. He just can't do them because, we're not allowed. But, this is serious stuff. The word that sort of came out last night, CNN broke a story that the people that understand this now are saying that it can be transmitted through, breathing and talking, and not just by sneezing and coughing. And boy, that changes, the price of poker, to be sure. So, now everyone I think is headed toward masks when they go out to get their groceries. Or, I had to pick up a prescription today on my way to the lake house, and there's a drive-through at our thing, but I wore a mask just because I don't want to get this virus, and I don't want to bring it to not only do I not want to get it, but I don't want to bring it to my family. So everyone's being careful.
Well, there is a touchy issue, and we're obviously across the border from you guys in Michigan, and there's about 6,500 healthcare workers living in Windsor who work in Michigan hospitals and come home to their families every day in Windsor. And some Windsor residents are starting to complain about that and saying, "Oh, they're bringing it back," because obviously it's much more virulent on your side of the border than it has been so far in Windsor. We just broke the 100 barrier for cases the other day. We're at 128 now. We've had our first death this week, so Windsor's been kind of really below the curve from a lot of major cities in North America in terms of how impactful this has been on our community. But people are fearful that these 6,500 healthcare workers who are basically right in the middle of ground zero and then are coming home, and then certainly I'm sure they're taking absolutely every measure they can to clean themselves and rid themselves of whatever they've picked up in the hospital, but it's got to be scary for them too, because they're coming home to their families. And if I was in the midst of that mess all day long, I'd be really terrified that I'd be coming home and giving it to my kids. Or
Yeah, I mean, we've seen many stories in America of the people, and let's face it, like these medical personnel, and I say personnel because there's not only doctors and nurses, but there's people who are servicing, the ventilators. There are people who have to come and clean the rooms and make it, safer for people. There's a whole lot of people who are in harm's way for this, and we've heard stories about those people. They come home after a 12-hour shift when they've been scared to death for 12 hours. And what do they got to do? Take off all their clothes in their garage and then go into their shower and basically sanitize their body before they can even say hello to their wife. And one doctor said, even after I do all that, my wife follows me around with a bottle of sanitary soap and making sure I don't touch anything. And it's just a horrible thing. There's no good that comes from this. But one thing that I thought of is that 9/11 sort of brought at least Americans to the realization of how important the military is to us and our preservation, our way of life, and of course the first responders who gave their lives trying to save people out of the Twin Towers. Well, this has given us a real understanding and a recognition of how important the medical personnel are in terms of dealing with this kind of things, and how they really do put their lives on the line. Like, this isn't the only infectious disease they've ever dealt with. Now, it's probably the scariest, but I'm sure they've all dealt with infectious diseases through the course of their career.
yeah, and amazingly, we talk about sports being shut down. There are two hockey leagues that are still playing. I've discovered today, and they're both in Eastern Europe in the old former Soviet Union. Now, there's something called the Liga Pro Short Hockey League, which exists in Russia. I don't know a whole lot about it. I tried to find rosters for teams today, no luck at all. But they play basically 30-minute games, 3 10-minute periods. That's why it's called the Short Hockey League. But they are still playing, and you can bet on those games. If you go to an online sports book, a lot of them are carrying odds on those games. And I find that just utterly baffling when you can't even find rosters of the teams on the internet. People are still going to bet on those games.
That would be a better story if the Short Hockey League was a league for players who are under 5'6".
Nathan Gervais league.
And imagine like where some of the Theo Fleury would have been the greatest player in that league's history if he had played in it. So yeah. Well, what did you learn about that? Who should we bet on?
Well, the teams, I looked at the names and they were all in Russian language and I couldn't really figure them out. But I did look into the other league, which is going, and that's the Belarus Extraliga. Now, Belarus, their president is a fellow named Alexander Lukashenko, who, like Vladimir Putin, plays a lot of hockey and doesn't skate very well, doesn't really move very fluidly with the puck, but much like Putin, scores about 5 or 6 goals, amazingly, every game he plays. Now, he has decided, from what I've read, and they've even done stories on him on CNN, that he can't see the coronavirus, so in his mind, it doesn't exist. And they are going on in Belarus as if there is no world pandemic. They're still doing everything they do normally. Everybody's living their normal lives. And the hockey league goes on to packed houses. I saw some footage of a game over there, and couldn't see an empty seat in the rink. They were playing hockey, and he's even gone out and organized a charity game, and played in it to just show people there's nothing to worry about. Well, a funny story about him. If you remember when Igor Larionov retired, they had a grand send-off game, a tribute game on the open-air rink outside the Kremlin, where he brought back a lot of the great players from those old Soviet powerhouses of the 80s, and they played an exhibition game against a lot of the Red Wings players that he won Stanley Cups with. And afterward, Larionov organized a tour for these Red Wing guys that came over to go play charity games in different countries or different cities around the former Soviet Union, and one of those games was in Belarus, and it just turned out that Mr. Lukashenko, the president, was playing on the team that these ex-Red Wings would be playing against. Now, Joe Koser was one of the Wings who'd gone over to play in this tour, and you know how athletes are. Even though he was a retired athlete, he still had his pregame rituals that he stuck to, and one of them was he liked to go out in the hallway outside the dressing room right before the game, after the warm up, and do just a little stretching right before he took the ice, just to kind of loosen up. And he said he'd always done this, and even after he retired and played in charity games, he still did it. So he goes to go out the dressing room door, and there's a guard on the door standing inside the door. And Koster says, "I got to go out." And the guy says, "No, you can't go out right now." And Koster pushes on the door, and it's locked from the outside. He says to the guard, he says, "What's going on? Why can't I go out there?" And he said, "Well, the president's coming in right now. No one's allowed in the hallway." And Koster said, "Well, I got to stretch." And the guy basically explained to him in broken English, that you go out in that hallway right now, and the only stretch you'll be doing is a stretch in a Belarusian prison, because when they say nobody comes in the hallway, they mean nobody. And he went over, of course, to Larionov and said, "Igor, what's going on here?" And basically, Igor gathered all the North American Red Wings together who weren't familiar with this guy and said, "Look, if he's got the puck, just let him go, let him carry it, let him shoot. Don't check him, don't touch him. You'll regret it." And Koster even then was thinking, "Yeah, come on, you don't tell an NHL tough guy what to do on the ice. They decide what they're going to do." But he said he walked out in the hallway, and all he could see as they went to the ice for the game were a phalanx of military personnel armed to the hilt with automatic weapons. And Joe said, "Yeah, that's fine. I thought, yeah, he's not worth taking out to never see my family again. So he wants to score. I'm okay with that." So that's Alexander Lukashenko. And so, as a lot of people think Donald Trump's doing a terrible job, well, Alexander Lukashenko said to Donald Trump, "Hold my beer."
Yeah, that's a different level of pressure playing in a hockey game. It's one thing to, when you want to win so bad you don't win it, to pressure upon yourself. But when you feel like you're in danger of being put in prison, that's a whole lot different level of pressure. So, um,
So we also had some economic hockey news today, and that also comes from Russia. The KHL team called the Vladivostok Admiral in the KHL, a fairly new team. They're an expansion team, I believe, in 2013-14 was their first season. And they announced today that they will not be able to compete next season in the KHL. They're taking a 1-year leave of absence because of the economic hardships brought on by having to shut the season down. They just say they won't have the operating capital to participate next season. And I looked at their roster, and the biggest name was a fellow named Sean Lalonde, who was a second-round pick of the Blackhawks in about 10 years ago, and has played mostly in Europe, played some in the AHL. But there was not a great list of talented players on this team. But the guy who's the president of the team, people will know, is a fellow named Alexander McGillney. So, I mean, obviously, I don't think any NHL team is going to have to fold or take a leave of absence from this, but this is certainly an indication of, this. Even the professional sports is feeling the same kind of economic hardships that all of us are right now. I mean, we're reading about different teams. The Ottawa Senators just announced they were laying off a bunch of staff members, and we've seen it in other cities too. It's taken a toll on everybody.
yeah, it really has. And the business model for the KHL, if my understanding is correct, um, is not one that could work anywhere other than in Russia. And most of these teams are subsidized, and their payroll doesn't reflect their revenue. They seem to spend more than they could possibly take in. They don't have arenas the size of NHL arenas, and their ticket prices aren't nearly what the ticket prices are in the NHL. And yet, they pay quality salaries. They in Europe they pay more than any other country. You can make okay money in Switzerland, and certainly in Sweden, if you're a top player, you can make a nice living, but not, you can get a salary that's commensurate with an NHL salary if you're a top player in the KHL. To be honest with you, I've been a little disappointed in from what I've been able to ascertain with the caliber of play, and I think the greatest reflection of that is that their top players who do come over here. You expect when you hear that they've signed the leading scorer in the KHL, you're thinking, "Whoa, okay, that guy's going to come over here," and it just doesn't necessarily translate. Like I think the level of play there, I kind of thought it would be sort of between the AHL and the NHL, but I'm not so sure that it's much better than the AHL, just based on the fact that their top players don't necessarily light it up unless they're an up and coming player, like a veteran player in the KHL who leads that league in goals isn't going to come over here and set the NHL on fire. But what's your thoughts on that? Where the level of play there is, Bob?
Well, I think we saw exactly that, as you point out, last year in the playoffs when Gusev signed with the Golden Knights when they're in the midst of their first round playoff series with the Sharks. Everybody thought, that was a pretty tight series and he could be a difference maker, a kind of a tipping point that could turn the series for Vegas. And they put him in the lineup and he didn't make any difference at all. He wasn't an impact player. He really wasn't a factor. And quickly as they inserted him, he was out again, and then they traded him. So there's a guy who went from, oh, this guy's going to be a superstar to we got to get rid of this guy in a matter of weeks.
Well, and that happened with another Russian they had as well. Remember the excitement, and now his name is escaping me when I need it. But
Shipyachov, wasn't it? Shipyachov?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And everybody thought he was going to play on their top line. He couldn't even make the roster. He ended up in the minors, and then he was disillusioned. He thought he was going to come over to the NHL and be a star, and boom, he was gone as quickly as And there was hype surrounding that. I remember writing stories about the excitement of hey, look, we might have gotten a top player, and right now there's a discussion about the Leafs are in on a Russian player who's supposed to be good, and the Coyotes as well, but. You always have to temper your enthusiasm now because history has kind of taught us that, just because you're great in the KHL doesn't mean. Now, saying that, the KHL has sent us some players who have performed pretty well, but oftentimes it comes down to the expectations. What's interesting is the number of Russians in the National Hockey League is really down from where it was early on when we first started bringing them over, when everybody wanted there was a romance with that Russian league and everybody was trying to get players, and now just only the top players play over here because given the opportunity where you can earn comparable money, I think most of them would rather stay home, play the reduced schedule, and not have to cross the pond to play, and be heroes in their own country. So
not have to uproot their whole lives to come and play on the other side of the world and be away from their families and their friends and everything. I remember a few years back they had the world's largest recreational hockey tournament was in Windsor, and they had divisions all the way from guys who could barely skate up to teams of ex-pros. And there was this team from Ukraine, and they were really good. And I looked them up, and half of them had played in the KHL. And their best player was Alexei Zhitnik, longtime NHL defenseman. And I talked to Alexei after the game when I went and saw them play, and he said these were all the guys, all his friends from when he was young in Ukraine. And when he went off to the NHL, he didn't see them basically, other than a couple months maybe in the summer for 20 years. And now he would just travel with them to these tournaments and get to play with all his buddies again. It was like just him hanging out with his pals, but they were all hockey players, and about half of them were guys that were good enough to play pro.
Yeah, I got a question for you. Actually, that was asking me, and we ended up with a debate on it. One of my friends was putting together, actually at Hockey Buzz, a tournament that's being done with a computer of the all-time greatest teams. So, like the all-time greatest Red Wings versus the Canadians versus the Vegas Golden Knights, who obviously is not a very high seed in this tournament because they have been around a long time. And the question we came up to is, is Igor Larionov among the greatest Detroit Red Wings of all time? And what's interesting about that is he played long enough, and he was certainly an important player and to the Red Wings during his era. But he wasn't in the height of his career when he did that. And he had a couple of really great seasons, and other seasons where his numbers weren't spectacular. And the Red Wings are a team with an incredible number of great players. And I argued that he should have been on that team. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Where does Igor Larionov fit on the all-time great Red Wings team?
Well, I guess it depends on where you play him. If you're playing him at center, it's pretty hard to crack. Your top three centers are probably going to be, Yzerman, Fedorov, Sid Abel. Not leaving a whole lot of room for centers beyond that. And then
then you got Normie Allman as well. But I think the way we looked at it is kind of the Team Canada approach, where give me your top 12 forwards and they'll all do what's necessary in order for the team to perform well. So in that regard, it's still hard. Because you're dealing with a lot of great players. You got Howe and Lindsay and Shanahan and a lot of players who have done a lot of great things for the Red Wings. But
if you go back to the 30s, you had guys like Larry Ory and Sid Howe. You had a lot of sensational players, basically from the mid 30s through the mid 50s. The Red Wings were pretty much a powerhouse team. There was a few down years in there, but for the most part, they were contending for the Stanley Cup almost every season.
And, it's interesting too. There's the defense too on that team. Like anybody that knows any of the history of the Red Wings knows that Reed Larson was one of the most prominent defensemen in the team's history. He was like the best player during at some of the seasons of the Dead Wing era. And he's a 20-goal scorer with just a hellacious shot and kind of a scary shot. I was never sure that Reed knew exactly where that rising slapper of his was going. But it's hard for him to even get a sniff on this defense. And when it came down to for us, which is really a tough situation, is Konstantinov versus Larry Murphy. Where are you in that argument? Because I think those are the number 6 defenseman candidates.
I think I'd have to go with Konstantinov because
me too.
Murphy was like Larionov. He was a great player, but he was near the end when he came to the Wings, and
right.
He was one of many guys who benefited from playing alongside Nick Lidstrom. Nick Lidstrom added years to a lot of guys' careers and made career years for a lot of guys. I mean, you think of all the guys that had the pleasure of playing next to him that wouldn't be considered all-star defensemen. I mean, when they won the Cup in 2002, Freddie Olesen was his partner most of that year, and Freddie Olesen had pretty much a decent career. He was a good, solid defenseman, but on that team, he was in the top pairing because he was with Nick Lidstrom. Right? Other than Paul Coffey early on in his career, and later on when he played with Rafalski, I don't know that Nick played with too many guys that could be considered his peer in ability.
Yeah. Well, the other news too is that we've heard news that the Ottawa Senators, and all I could think of is I keep reading that there's a few more members of the team of the organization. I think it's 3 players and someone within the organization, or 2 players. I've forgotten now, but it's almost like the Senators just don't get a break. Their owner fans are just weary of him, they bottomed out. They lost Alfredson, they lost Carlson. They had a lot of favorite players, and they've lost all them. And here we are dealing with this, and they're the team that has the most people with the virus. It's just almost like it's they don't get a break. And I see now where they're having to reduce staff. But
Mhm.
now saying all that, but they're going to end up with two high draft picks, and they could end up with, if the lottery goes well, two of the top three picks, depending on what happens with the NHL draft lottery.
And 3 first rounders in total. So I mean, you can fix
Yeah,
a lot of areas of need when you're drafting multiple times in the first round. I mean, people talk about the Wings stockpiling draft picks, but the Wings have stockpiled picks in the later rounds, the second, third, fourth, fifth, and you need players to come from those picks. You need to find players in the later rounds if you're going to be a successful franchise. But it's pretty rare you're going to find a difference maker beyond the first round. It happens, I mean, but less and less now because the game is scouted so efficiently now that guys just don't fall through the cracks like they did maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. You're not going to find a Henrik Zetterberg in the fifth or sixth round anymore, or a Henrik Lundqvist, the kind of guys that fell, for a variety of reasons. Often it was size, or, and certainly that was the concern with Zetterberg. They thought maybe he was too frail to play in the NHL, but nowadays, I don't think size is as big an issue as it was, 10, 15 years ago. So again, that's another reason why guys who might have fallen through the cracks in the past aren't going to now. So I think having 3 first round picks really gives you a chance to turn it around quickly, because you should get 3 guys not only that'll play in the league, but as you say, if they get 2 lottery picks, they're gonna get 2 guys that can probably be instant difference makers.
yeah, and it's so hard to rebuild in the National Hockey League because of the 18-year-old draft. Like, and there's no proven way to do it. Like, you know, uh, there seems to be a trend now, certainly in the National Hockey League, to just go ahead and embrace rebuilding. Just announce it to your fans, send a letter to season ticket holders, uh, and just go ahead and do it. Strip it down to the chassis a la the Toronto Maple Leafs, and hope the gods smile upon you, because you know it has worked. I mean, the Maple Leafs haven't won, but it worked out for them. I mean, they're a contending team, and they did it relatively quickly. But look at the Edmonton Oilers. They had all those number one picks, and they went gone through a period where making the playoffs um, was almost a prize, and they haven't won that prize very often. Um, and and then even when you get a pick on what to do with him, like there's no consensus on whether you send them back or bring them in and have someone sort of mentor them. And I thought about that because I just wrote a piece this week on um, Alex Turcotte, who was the number 5 pick overall 2019 of the LA Kings. His dad played in the Alfie Turcotte played in the NHL, and his grandfather played at Michigan State, and it's kind of known in hockey circles for running a very good hockey school for years in Michigan that developed a lot of players. So Turcotte has a real high hockey IQ. He's got hockey in his DNA, in his blood, and there's two thoughts on Turcotte next year. He's come after 1 year. He signed with the Kings, and he's a very skilled player. John Van Briesbroek, the former NHL goalie, who's now sort of the U.S. national team's player, said that he reminds him a little bit even of Paul Kariya, his ability to dart in and out of spaces and sort of create sort of dynamic scoring chances. And then other scouts have told me that he's got a little Patrice Bergeron in him because he plays a 200-foot game. He's smart enough to do that. So the Kings are now down near the bottom. So the question is next year, do you bring Turcotte in and let him suffer, because this team isn't going to be great next season, this Kings team. They're not, even with Kopitar and Doughty, they're not good enough to, be a playoff team. Or do you put them down in the minors for a while with some of their other, prospects, and, let them sort of grow together, and maybe they can have some success down there because they've got some decent prospects, and then sort of change it around. But I would lean. I think you got to sort of look at the individual player, and I think because he being Turcotte is a little advanced for his age. Like to me, I would just throw him there and hope that Kopitar can mentor him and that he could sort of have an impact. But that doesn't always happen. Like we want to think that all number one picks are going to be like Sidney Crosby, but they're not. Like Jack Hughes is a tremendous prospect, but he didn't set the world on fire this year. In the NHL, that doesn't mean he's not a great player because he will be. So I think it's tricky business trying to sort that all out. But anyway, what's your take on how you deal with that? And I also think you got to sell hope to the fan base. Like that's another reason sometimes to keep the guy is fans are sophisticated now, and if you got a really good one, even if he's not playing at his highest level, at least fans can sort of see the potential there.
Yeah, I mean, and you're in a city where you got to sell tickets too, and especially now, like we were talking about that the other day. Like it's one of the toughest jobs in sports has got to be the guy who's got to get on the phone and sell people on the worthiness of buying season tickets for next season. Because I got to think people are still going to be a little bit, I don't know, if frightened's the right word, but a little bit concerned about going back into big gatherings of people. And do you want to make a full season commitment to buying tickets and then find out, within 10 games of the season, the virus breaks out again and all of a sudden they're telling people not to gather anymore? Like it's just, I think it's going to be a real tough sell and you're going to need to give people reasons to want to come back. And, as you say, selling hope, bringing in young, talented players that are the future. And then I was at the World Junior Summer Showcase in Plymouth last summer, and LA had more players on the ice than any NHL team between the Canadian, U.S., Swedish, and Finnish teams. And everybody there, all the scouts said LA's got just a ton of prospects, and LA should be on the way back up real soon. So, how soon is the question. The Buffalo Sabres are like the Oilers. They got a ton of young prospects. They've had a lot of early draft picks, a lot of guys in the lottery, and yet they still can't seem to get around that corner and become a playoff team. So there's
Yeah, but
there's no formula that's guaranteed to work.
yeah, no, but that with the Sabres, you could see it. Like even when the Oilers had those first round picks, you'd watch them and you couldn't see the hope. When I watch the Sabres, I can see the hope. Like I get it that they haven't figured it out yet, but I see a lot of potential there, and I think that's the difference. But looks like we've run out of time.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you next time, but I'll have this lighting figured out. I'm not sure what the deal is on it, but
Well, I did hear today that because of so many people working from home and that there's a lot more strain on the internet at this time of day than there normally would be because of the demand with so many people working at home. So we can blame our technological problems on the circumstance of COVID. We're blaming everything else on it. So we might as well blame this too.
well, I like that because I've been sitting here and I haven't moved, and I've been getting darker and then lighter and lighter, and I haven't done a darn thing. So hopefully I'll have that figured out by next week.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. And we'll be back again on Monday. And have yourself a safe weekend, is the best thing, I guess, to say right now.
See ya.